Hey dear friends, Seamus here. Thank you for joining me today. It's the 1st of February, what some would call Brigid's Day. What a splendid day to share a story from the life of Brigid, that great woman from Irish history. My favorite story concerning her is called Brigid and the Wolves. So let's just go ahead and get started, shall we? Our story begins a timeless time ago on that beautiful island that today we would simply call Ireland. And at that time, all those generations ago, there was a young woman named Brigid who had left her childhood home and moved across the land to the edge of a great and ancient forest. And there, under the shade of a mighty old gnarly oak tree, she built herself a small hut and began her new life. She loved the place that she was living in, surrounded by the forest, and out in front of her cottage was a wide open meadow that was filled with all the beautiful wildflowers. And at the springtime of the year, it was full of dandelions, her favorite, because when the sun shone on them, they looked like little suns themselves, and it made her very happy. The forest around her and behind her was filled with all the beautiful wild things of life, the wildflowers, the wild food, the leaves and the trees and the birds and the bees, and all of the wildlife, including her beloved wild wolves. Brigid loved them all, and they loved her. Well, her reputation had preceded her. She was already known for being a woman much given to hospitality, much given to caring for others, and very gifted in the arts of healing. And it didn't take long for people to come to her new hut to visit her and ask for her help, which she was only too happy to give. Some of those people cared for Brigid so much and loved the land where she was living so much that they stayed there. They settled and began to build their own little huts, and a village rose up. And over the course of the next year or so, there was enough people there that it had come to the attention of the local king. And he came by to visit and see himself what was happening. Well, he looked through the village and he made his way towards Brigid's hut. He knew of her by reputation, and she, of course, knew of him. And as she approached her hut, she was delighted to see that as he walked towards her with a few guards and a few advisors, more importantly, down by his ankles, there was a little wolf pup, a little baby wolf. And Brigid learned that the wolf had come to him because sadly its mother had been slain, and they brought the pup to him to care for, and he was raising the pup up almost like his pet, his most trusted little friend. And this pleased Brigid very much. Well, they met and they exchanged the affairs of the day, and they shared a welcome cup, of course, and the king went on his way, and all was well. Well, over the next several years, of course, the village grew. More and more people came and stayed, and farms began to open up. The land was open. There was barns built and buildings and more people and babies being born, as always happens. And of course, the farmers not only grew crops, but they had wildlife. They had sheep and goats and pigs and chickens and so on. And one particular spring, word came into the village of great concern that somehow several of the sheep had been killed at the edge of the woods. And of course, everybody blamed the wolves, which was not entirely a wrong thing to do because, wolves are hungry and wolves are going to eat what wolves are going to eat. But the people were very, very upset by this. And they sent a messenger to the king and they said, "The wolves in your woods, your highness, are killing our sheep. What will you do about it?" And the king's response was simply, "If something is attacking my kingdom, it's an enemy, it must be dealt with." And he said to all of his hunters and all of his woodsmen, "If you're out in the forest and you see a wolf, kill it and bring it to me and I will reward you one shiny silver penny." Well, word got back to the villagers that the king's response was to kill the wolves, and the villagers didn't want that. They didn't want the wolves dead. They just didn't want their sheep dead. And they went to Brigid and asked her whatever they could do, and she said, "Rest assured, I will care for this." And the very next morning, she got up on her little pony cart, rode her way down into the deep depths of the forest, found her favorite little shady glade where she shook off her shawl and sat herself down on the grass to wait. And as she sat and she waited throughout the day, she had a bit of lunch with her, and the wild wolves came out of the forest one by one and two by two and visited with Brigid. And she gave them a little scritch behind the ear, some got a little rub on the belly, and she shared her lunch with them and asked them simply to not kill the sheep. There is more than enough in the forest for them to eat. Leave the sheep be. And of course, the wolves agreed. But the king, he had already made his edict and never thought to retract it. Well, the very following spring, realizing that very few sheep had been killed after that, but sadly the following spring reports were brought back to the king that there were deer being slain in the forest. And of course everybody blamed the wolves. And in truth, the wolves had no idea that this was now the king's forest and the king's deer. They'd been hunting in those forests forever. It's what wolves do. It's the great pattern of life. But all of a sudden, the king was very angry. And now he told all of his huntsmen and all of his woodcutters, "If you're in the woods and you see a wolf, slay it and bring me the corpse, and I will give you a shiny gold coin." And again, much concern was raised to Brigid, but it was the king's land and it was his edict, and all they could do was wait and see what happens. Well, sadly, just a few days later, the king himself had been out on a hunt. And he was running through the woods on his horse, and of course he had his wolf with him, now full grown and a magnificent beast with very distinctive markings. And they went on their hunt, and they circled back around towards the king's hunting lodge, built not that far away from the village. And when they went in and tacked up the horse, the king realized that the wolf was not there. And he understood that sometimes his wolf, who was still wild at heart, loved to go and run through the forest and visit with all of his wolfy friends, and the king thought nothing of it. But sadly, later that day, the wolf, who was much accustomed to being around people, smelt the smells of the village, the wood smoke and the meat being cooked, and he made his way towards the village. And sadly, at the edge of the village was a woodsman. And seeing the wolf, he laid down his axe, picked up his bow, nocked an arrow, drew, and fired, and shot the wolf right in the chest. Thinking he had done a good thing, thinking he had done what his king said to do, he laid down his bow, took up a rope, and began to drag the wolf through the woods back to the king's hunting lodge. And coming through the gates, he called out to the king and to his guards, "Your Majesty, I have brought you a wolf." And the king turned and immediately reached into his pocket to pull out a gold coin. But in walking towards the woodsman, he looked down and from the distinctive markings realized that this woodsman had killed his beloved friend, his pet wolf. And the king became very, very angry. And rather than paying a gold coin, he ordered his guards to take the man and throw him into the cells and hold him. And then he told his carpenters to begin building a gallows, for the very next day he would see this selfish man hang for destroying his friend. Well, word got back to the village of what the king had said and what had happened with the woodsman and the wolf, and everyone was heartbroken that the king had lost his beloved wolf and friend, but still in all, they didn't want to see their woodsman punished for doing what the king had told him to do. And that very next morning, before the sun was up, Brigid mounted her pony wagon and made her way towards the king's stronghold. Along the way, as they traveled down the trail, she kept seeing something that looked almost like a white shadow off in the woods beside her. And it got to the point that it got closer and closer to the point that her little pony began to shy and buck. And Brigid had to speak soothing words out over the beast. And it calmed and all was well. But then, as they came around the bend in the trail, that white shadow came closer to the edge. And suddenly it leapt into the air. And Brigid was not at all surprised when beside her on the bench of the wagon there landed a magnificent, massive white wolf. Pale blue eyes, long jaw, massive teeth. And the wolf's response to Brigid was to lean over and give her a lick on the cheek. And Brigid laughed and scritched the wolf behind the ear, and off they went down the trail. And the next bend of the path took them within sight of the king's hunting lodge. And riding up to the gates, the guards saw Brigid coming and knew that she was welcome, so they opened the gates. And they called out that Your Majesty, Brigid was here. And as she rolled in her cart and began to step down, the king came out of his quarters and saw this magnificent white beast. And his eyes bugged, and he was stunned by the beauty of the animal, and he greeted Brigid and asked what he could do for her that day, but his eyes never left the wolf. And Brigid said, Your Majesty, you put a bounty on the wolves, and sadly it has cost you your best friend. Now you have imprisoned the woodsman that was simply obeying your rules, and still we have a dead wolf, and now we might have a dead man who is innocent. My Majesty, what could we possibly do? And the king looked at Brigid and said, I gave the order was obeyed, but still I'm heartbroken. That was my very best friend. And even in saying this and even expressing his sorrow, he still kept looking at the white wolf. And he said, Brigid, in all your wisdom, is there anything you could suggest to me to make this situation right? And she said, Good king, good and kind king, whom the people respect. You do not want to slay an innocent man for simply obeying your orders. And I understand you're heartbroken about losing your wolf, but perhaps we have a solution that will help everyone. And what Brigid suggested to the king was two things. One, that he released the woodsman from his imprisonment, for indeed he had done nothing but what the king had ordered him to do. And perhaps he could remove his edict against the wolves. He could take down his order about killing the wolves on sight and bringing them in for a bounty. She said, if you release the woodsman and remove the bounty upon the wolves in your forest, good king, I'm sure that perhaps this young man would like to be your friend. And the king looked at the wolf and looked back at Brigid and he said, are you telling me that you can make this wolf my friend? And she said, I can do nothing but ask. But good king, if you do what is right for your people, my friend shall do what is right for you. The king immediately gave the order to have the woodsman brought out of the cells, and he declared before his scribes and his retinue and all of his guards that the order to kill the wolves had been rescinded, and the wolves were free to roam through his royal forest so long as they kept their distance from the village. And at that point, Brigid leaned down, and taking the ear of the wolf, she whispered kind words, and gave him a scritch behind the ears and sent him off. And the wolf loped across the yard up onto the dais where the king sat on his throne. The guards reached for their spears, but Brigid just waved them down. And getting beside the king, the wolf sat down on his haunches, laid his head down on the king's lap, and sighed. And the king knew that he had a new friend to ease the soreness of his heart. And the woodsman was standing by. Brigid told him to get up into his cart, and he did. She gave her farewells to the king. He returned to her his greetings, his best wishes, and his thanks for her wisdom. And off they went out of the king's stronghold and down the path back to the village. The woodsman was returned to his people, indeed innocent after all. The order against the wolves was rescinded, and there was no more slaughter. And the farms grew, and the village prospered, and the king was happy. And Brigid went on about her life as if it was just another day. For when you are given to service, doing the right thing is never a hardship. I do thank you very kindly, my friends, for joining me today. However you keep this first day of February, whether you had sunshine today or snow, rain or sleet, whatever is going on in your life today, I hope that you are well. And until we meet again in just about a week's time, I pray that you take good care of yourselves and take good care of each other. I appreciate you being here. Thank you for the likes and the shares and the coffees and all that stuff. But more importantly, join me in just about a week's time when we'll share another tale. Until then, take good care. Cheers.